Hey, this is Todd. I hope that this will be the start in a new series of videos, which I am calling, I think, Designing the Dynamic Dungeon, in which I want to try to rethink a little bit, work through some of maybe the problems that at least I see in dungeons, or at least how dungeons are often presented in gaming materials, and then think about what we can do with those problems, what solutions we can come up with to ameliorate them or eliminate them, or just give them a little bit of a different spin in terms of, as the title of this video suggests, making them more dynamic. The first one of these issues I'm going to deal with, which will hopefully help explain the overall feeling, is this, what I would say is the issue of stasis in a dungeon. And that is the idea, the concept that the dungeon is basically a static place that you have a series of, and again, just to be very, or not again, but to be very broad, you have corridors and you have rooms. Rooms are where encounters happen. Those are places in which there are creatures and things to encounter, and corridors are essentially the connectors that get you from encounter to encounter. That doesn't mean that there are never encounters in corridors. And of course, in corridors, we'll often have traps and those sorts of obstacles. But generally speaking, if you look at a dungeon, it's going to have a series of rooms, and those rooms will be numbered. That's where your encounters are. And then mostly if there's a note about a trap or something about that in a corridor, but generally the corridors are basically just there to get you from room to room. An example I'm going to use for this is, couldn't tell what that is, Cragmaw Hideout from the Lost Mines of Phandelver, Lost Mine of Phandelver, the campaign that comes in the starter kit, because it illustrates, I think, this issue. And of course, in a way of giving it a little bit more, I want to say resonance or a context, this is, for a lot of players in 5th edition, this is the first dungeon that they will see. So that what you learn about dungeons comes from what you experience. And this is going to be one of the first dungeons you experience. What do you learn from that? Going back to corridors and rooms, you have corridors that generally lead you from room to room. If we look at Cragmaw Hideout, you can see we have numbered areas, and then you have corridors in between them, and we would look to the notes about what the look and feel of those corridors, what they generally are, if there's a trap in them or something else we need to note. And then really it's on to the numbered areas, which is really, as GMs, DMs, we are looking for, okay, what is are there creatures in here, or are there, what's in here? These are really the points of interest. Now, if we go back to OSR and that era of dungeon delving, we're looking with a lot of either mega dungeons or dungeons with lots of different competing elements. If we think to the Caves of Chaos and Keep on the Borderlands, how there is not one species that holds dominance. There are multiple cultures in there. You have, maybe you have there's trolls and there's goblins. I think it's trolls or ogre. Sorry if my memory is escaping me. There are, goblins. There are orcs. So in this kind of cosmopolitan, in a sense, dungeon, it makes more sense that the creatures are going to be somewhat in their lairs, as that's going to be their main point of area where we would find them, and the corridors more like the open corridors in a building, not necessarily going to have a particular thing that lives there, right? Because it's like if you're caught out in the open, where are you going to go? You're going to go to your lair, you're going to go to your room, and that's where you're going to have all your stuff. But as we move past that and we get into basically single species kind of lairs or single cultures that control a lair, it becomes more like the hallway in your house, when at any given moment, and even in a cosmopolitan dungeon, any given moment, someone could be walking through the hallway in their house. To that end, in the OSR, you had wandering monsters, which was meant to simulate this idea that in these shared spaces, these corridors, anything could happen, anything could kind of pop out of the woodwork or come around a corner and face you, which lent an air of dynamism there, because it wasn't just, well, what's in that door, but okay, we were messing around with the door there, or what's behind the door rather. We're messing at this door, trying to figure it out, but something could be coming down the hallway behind us. It had that feel to it. A lot of modern dungeons, modern design has done away with wandering monsters, and of course you can find examples where they've been brought back or people have used them, but for the most part, we're looking at something like Cragmaw Hideout, there are no wandering monsters. It's really only the monsters are there in these named locations. What does this teach your players? What does this teach the party? Something that's come up I find a lot in looking at GMs dealing with the modern game and just the kind of play that it fosters is you have the, and this is not new by any means, but it makes more sense in the modern game, is we want to take a short rest or we want to camp overnight in the dungeon, and the party just feels like they can just plop down in a hallway and take a nap. And you think, well, why would you do that? Well, sure, yes, if you're really picturing the fiction, it makes no sense that you would be in the middle of taking down a hostile forces inside a tunnel and cave network and decide that we're just going to pop down and take a nap in front of this door. But when you look at, on a meta level, what players have learned how the dungeon experience goes, they know, or they've learned that the encounter is going to be on the other side of that door. They're not in the encounter area, they're in that corridor, and if there's no trap or nothing else has been triggered, then essentially they're safe. Much like in a computer video game, when okay, I know that I'm going to trigger the boss encounter in that room, but standing right outside that room, I know I haven't hit the invisible tripwire, so I can rejuvenate my spells, drink all my potions, do whatever I need to do to get ready. It's the same kind of thing, and it may seem silly if we look at it from the fiction, but on a meta level, what players are taught, it does make sense, because they haven't been taught that through their experience that the corridors are just as deadly as the encounter spaces, or they should be, though they really aren't. So let's go back to Cragmaw Hideout. We see here, and again, I will try, well, again, I keep saying again, I'll try to get, I think I found a picture of it online that I will post so that we can all look at it together, instead of me just holding up a copy of the map. But we have the first two encounter areas take place outside the dungeon. Oh, and I guess I should say spoilers for Lost Mines of Phandelver, but I want to use this as an example. It is basically the first dungeon you come across. It's very early in the campaign, so hopefully if you're running it, this might be something you can use to mix things up with your party about how it works. But obviously if you plan on playing through Lost Mines of Phandelver, maybe give this video a pass or watch it and then just forget about it, that I tend to. So a couple things we get to first. I really like, Cragmaw has a couple of different ways you can access it, not from the outside, but once you're in there, it's got some of the things that we like in dungeon design. It has some multiple different levels. It's just in terms of there's some verticality to it. There's an interesting environmental element with the stream that runs through the dungeon. It's got a couple of branches that you can figure out how to get around and give you some different options, so it's not just a one-way kind of monster corridor. It has some interesting interactive elements, but I'm going to get into that a little bit and sort of, but they're oddly limited. So I'll just jump in there first. So the first encounter area is outside the dungeon, right? The party's approaching, and you have lookouts. And I apologize, the heater kicked in there. If you're always going to get an uptick in noise, and I'm not able to reduce it in post, I do what I can with the budget I've got, so apologies for that. But getting back to it, the party's approaching this cave entrance, and I think in terms of the adventure, they followed a goblin trail up here, so they should know that there are bad guys nearby. And they set up this encounter area where there are some goblins who are essentially on lookout. And I think, hey, that's a great idea, right? And it teaches the players. If, again, we're looking at this as, hey, it's the first dungeon you're going to see, it's the first thing you're going to be taught. People are going to be protecting their homes, they're going to be looking out. But what does the actual adventure tell us about these lookouts? A, they're probably not paying attention. Okay, that might make sense in terms of the context of the adventure, that they're not expecting an attack, so they're not paying attention. But the second thing is yes, you've got this great idea with the party following up the stream or potentially following that trail. They're coming up upon the cave entrance, and you have these goblins who are kind of protected by a thicket, and they're off to the side, and they're theoretically keeping watch, doing a good job or bad job, whatever. But what happens with that? We might think in the fiction, what is a lookout's job? The lookout's job is to warn the people that they're looking out for that something's coming. But in the adventure, they don't do that. They just attack. So it's 2 goblins, they attack, and then they're killed. There's no warning for help. There's no ringing a bell. And of course, you could add those in, and maybe DMs have added them in. But if you're a new DM who's also running this for new players, you may not even think or know, oh, I can do that, or oh, I should be doing that. So right there, this is that stasis problem, because yes, you've got this little interactive element with, ooh, they're coming, and if the party's smart, maybe they could sneak up on the goblins in the thicket and do that, which would be great. But it has no significance to the rest of the dungeon. Whether the party discovers the goblins in their little lookout or not, it changes the nature of an encounter. So maybe the goblins get a first shot, and so that makes the encounter harder, or you surprise the goblins and sneak up on them, and you get the first shot, and it makes the encounter a little bit easier. But how does this affect the dungeon? It doesn't. It's a great kind of thing that gives you the illusion that, oh, there's lookouts or stuff happening, but there's really nothing happening. It's just, there's some goblins here. That stasis being that this encounter area just stays in this encounter area. What happens in that thicket, like Vegas, doesn't leave the thicket, which is unfortunate. But I guess it presents the problem. And I understand it. From a published material standpoint, I get it. You have a limited amount of space. You have a whole adventure. It's in a fairly thin, let's see, it's including everything in it. It's 63 pages, and that's including some monster stats and things in the back. And so you don't have tons of space to put in all these different elements you might want to. You kind of leave it. You sort of, I think, for a lot of things, you want to you just push it to the DM and say, hey, DM. We've called them lookouts. None of our actions mention the fact that they're going to actually be looking out in a way that makes sense for the dungeon, but you can do that if you want or not if you don't want. And I don't know how to fix that, and that may be in a future video as far as if I was going to try to publish a dynamic dungeon, how I would do that. It's actually been on my mind. It's something I want to do. I just don't know really how to express it yet in a way that will make sense to people other than me. However, for a home game, you don't need to worry about that. All you need to do is have notes that make sense to you and that you can remember. And if I was going to redo Cragmaw's the hideout, the first thing I would do with that is give some kind of mechanism through which these lookouts could actually warn the rest of the goblins in the caves that something's coming. Now, what that would be, I don't know. And there's interesting things to do with that. Just like it's interesting that, as I've read, some parties have figured out, let's creep around the side and let's take a look around here and discover the goblins. If you have a mechanism that gives the party something that they could potentially deactivate, there was, say, a wire or a rope, and the goblins could pull the rope, and some bell down in the depths of the caves would go off. What if the party discovered that first? What if they could keep the tension, keep it tied off so it doesn't slack and ring the bell, but then cut it so that when the other goblin goes to ring it, all it just happens is rope comes over, right? These are great moments as well, but we don't get advantage of them. So we're in this, we get through that, we get into the caves. There's the stream, which is going to be a big thing. Again, they talk about I think they said there's something like 20 goblins in here, but they're basically in very static areas, which means that your party just gets to go from room to room, really like a video game, right? Okay, go in this room, we can clear them out, go in this room, we can clear them out, and nothing relates to each other. It's static. They're just sitting there waiting for you to either find them or bypass them, with no concept or thought given to, hey, if you are at one of these rooms and you're fighting, does that sound carry down the corridor to the other guys? And what do they do? The interesting place where the formula bends a little bit is when you get to this encounter by the bridge, where there's another goblin that's hiding, a secondary lookout. And what they do is, if they find you and they're able to alert, they're going to alert some goblins in another area to open this dam that has been keeping or controlling the flow of the stream. So they're basically going to flood this tunnel. Wow, that's cool, right? This is dynamic, isn't it? I mean, this is what we've been asking for. This is what I've just been talking about, and they deliver it. Well, yes and no. If you really think about it, it's really just a trap. You could have that be a tripwire. It could be anything. if you don't pass that check and they spot you and you don't spot them, hey guys, open the trap door. And they open the trap door, the thing floods, but then that's it. There's, according to this, unless I missed something, they open the tunnels and then they open the flood, not the flood tunnels, they open up the water holding area to unleash the flood into the tunnel, and then I guess they just sit and wait. There's no concept of they're going to gather the forces, they're going to do something, they're going to try to run out a back door, or how they're going to deal with this. It's just another missed opportunity, because even though you've got this, I would say, illusion of dynamism, all it really is a trap. The trap is a goblin hollering instead of a tripwire or a pressure plate, something like that. So it ends up really, once you take away the trappings of a dynamic, living, breathing place, the goblin's just a stand-in for a tripwire or a pressure plate. So they come through here, they pick everything else, and then maybe they'll have an easy time, maybe they'll have a hard time. But what they're going to learn from this is that, you, again, like I mentioned, corridor, room. So how do we fix this? If I was going to fix Cragmaw Hideout, and maybe I will. I know people have done a lot of stuff on DM's Guild, and this is not new, and I'm sure, I am sure folks have already posted all kinds of stuff about Phandelver. Let me know in the comments something if you'd be interested. If I kind of tried to do sort of a redux of Cragmaw Hideout and threw it somewhere. Obviously, if I don't throw it on DM's Guild, I cannot call it Cragmaw Hideout, but I could call it Whamgark Hideout. It's Cragmaw backwards if you're not following at home. But how do we fix this? If I'm looking at this in my home game and I've got the time and the inclination to kind of take this and rejuvenate, what would I do? Like I mentioned, I want the lookouts to actually be looking out. And looking out, yeah, sure, they could confront the party. Though again, I would say your 2 goblins, your average D&D party is probably 4 or 5. You 2 goblins taking a couple of pot shots with your bow and arrows, not a good waste of your lives, or good use of your lives. It's a waste. It's a losing effort unless you get lucky. I don't care if they're first level. Your 2, they're going to be 3 to 6, 7 in some cases. That's not a great situation. So I would give them some kind of mechanism, or I would simply say that, hey, these goblins just run into the cave. They just run in, or I would maybe add a back door, because you're in this thicket. And the other thing with just the positioning of this thicket is the thicket is not, you don't have cover from the cave itself, and the party could, if they're moving fast enough, actually cut the goblins off from the cave, which again, if you're supposed to be giving an early warning system, you don't want your enemy to basically be able to get by you and either prevent you warning them or get around it. That's a little bit, it just doesn't make a lot of sense, right? So I would either add another passageway, something where they could sneak in, some kind of side door, trap door somewhere, maybe cut out of the rock, just a little thing that they're goblins, they're tiny, they could slither through to get through, or maybe a bell or a horn, some way of alerting the goblins inside. But that's easy. I just write down, okay, goblin, they call the horn. They blow the horn, and they're saved. But the rest of it's trickier. And this is why I say this is going to be a series, and it's going to be something I'm going to debate back and forth, because for every solution I might come up with, that it introduces some potential pitfalls. And maybe that's why kind of the way modules have laid out dungeons has essentially been unchanged for a long stretch of time, is because there isn't necessarily a great way to do it. And one thing I like about random encounters, or I really should call them wandering monsters, is that it is easy to do. And it makes sense, and it can give you that feeling of dynamic encounters. I could simply add a wandering monster, a table, wandering goblins. I could say, okay, if you're inside the caves, I'm going to roll a d6 every 10 minutes or so, and then depending on what I roll, some amount of goblins or their dogs or both will show up. But the problem with the random encounters, not the problem, but maybe I would say the downside is the stuff that's static still remains static. The Bugbear Chief stays in the Bugbear Chief's room, regardless of wandering monsters. Yeah, my first idea I had, and again, tell me in the comments, and hopefully I'll be doing more of these where I'll be developing different ideas. is to get rid of your encounter areas, not in terms of describing them, number them, describe them, but you're not going to tie the area to the creatures, at least the creatures that can move, that are inside of it. If that makes sense. So if we look at Area 8, which I think is the hideout, or sorry, the den of the chief, Clarg. This is Clarg's cave. In the description, as Phandelver gives it, Clarg is in his cave. Clarg and his sidekicks and his pet 2 goblins and his pet wolf. They're in that cave permanently. Wandering monsters may be happening if I'm using them, but Clarg is always going to be in his cave. So maybe the first thing I would do, and the first thing maybe you should try or give it a try if this seems like it might make sense to you, is to split up your encounter area with the creatures that might be in that area. And the idea being is that for most of the day, most of the time really someone's going to be coming through there, there's a chance Clarg's going to be in his cave. But Clarg's not a prisoner. Doesn't have to be in the cave. He doesn't have to be in the lair at all. So why not I use sort of a wandering monster type of table, but instead of it being just random things, I'm going to take these groups, these units of creatures, and I'm going to put them on the chart. And once they come up once, then they come off. So if I roll up and in the entrance, for example, let's say that there were originally, well, I'll just use Clarg. So let's just say I've done that. So I've taken them all together, and I'm going to say that I usually use one, the original way for doing Wandering Monsters is you would roll 1d6, and then you would roll on another table after that to see what shows up. Maybe I would combine that into one roll and just have a bunch, some of it mean just nothing, and then have these encounter groups on the other one. So let's just say, for example, I'm using a d12. I've determined that I have 8 different encounter groups. Some combination, so there's Clarg, the wolf, and his 2 goblin henchmen, and then there's maybe a set of the 4 goblins, and then maybe there's some of just these wolf hounds or wolves that they have, and then maybe a couple of goblins who are running errands, maybe even a prisoner or a slave if they use whatever indentured servants that might be doing stuff in the caves, and that even doesn't always have to be a combat encounter. Just could be an encounter. What might you find walking through those caves on a given day in these goblin caves? So I might roll a die. Okay, I get Clarg. Maybe I get Clarg right in the entrance of the cave. I mean, that would be a change. He's coming out to get some fresh air. I don't think they have urinals. I don't think they talk about where they restore their personal comfort, as my father might say. Maybe he's going out there. Maybe he's going to go hunting. Maybe he's going to go talk to somebody. Just going to go on a walkabout. Maybe Clarg's right there in the entrance. So then if you encounter Clarg in the entrance, then you could cross him off the list. And he won't be in Clarg's cave, in his cave or anywhere else. He's gone. And then if you able to knock out all those set encounters, then it's cleared. Then there's no random encounters show up, because that's assuming that you've taken care of everybody. Or you could even do like they do, and they say something like, hey, there are 20 goblins in this cave. So you keep a running tally in between your set encounters, and you add some other goblins in your random encounters, and that's the total amount. And if you get all of those, then you're out. But what this does is it means that you can encounter Clarg anywhere. So instead of just saying, well, Clarg is going to be in this one room, and again, I'll try to get a map up, but there, right? Clarg. What if you encounter Clarg by the bridge or under the bridge in there? And then the goblin scout or Clarg himself tells them to flood the chamber, flood the cave, flood that tunnel. That's a really cool encounter. You've taken what essentially was just a trap, take some damage or maybe get swept away a little bit. That's it. Now you've turned it into, now you have a super dynamic encounter. And what have you done? You really haven't done much. All you've done is decoupled this one place from this one room and said, hey, they're going to be anywhere. They could be walking around doing anything. That's my idea and again, I hope I will have more of these to do. This one, something to try if you're running your own dungeons. And I think there's a thing out there where people want to design their dungeons for their home games like they see in modules, and there's really no reason to. Unless you want to publish it, don't do that, because there are many limitations and things they are trying to do for the books. You do not have to do it for your home game. So you do not have to just set up your encounters and your dungeon areas like they do for store-bought module for yourself. And I would think that for yourself, you could come up with something much more richer and more dynamic, which is the whole point of this video, by breaking the rules that they've set for themselves because of limitations in paper and in content and trying to make it easy. And I understand, right, for this, how it might be difficult to try to get across. Any room, anything could happen. It could be very overwhelming for a home DM or for a new DM, but if you have the opportunity to try this out, try it. And I would say for this episode, to wrap it up, the thing I would try to get out of this static dungeon formula is decouple your creatures from the dungeon from the rooms in which they most likely will be. Or maybe not even most likely. I mean, if he's not sleeping, why would Clark be in his cave? Unless maybe that's where people have their audience with Clark. In which case, and you could do this with anything, right? Is you can set up the odds, and I love to use dice. If you've seen any of my videos, I love to leverage randomness to get some really interesting, not to overuse the phrase, but dynamic kind of results. Roll some dice and say, hey, he's got a 50% chance of being there, or he's got a 50% chance of being somewhere else. And you could make a system like that. But the idea here is decouple the creatures from the places. Use some kind of triggering mechanism. If you want to use the OSR classic 10 minutes or 120 feet traveled or something similar has happened, roll dice. Do that. If you want to do a different kind of trigger, you could use that same kind of trigger for your corridors. If you want to use a different trigger for your rooms, you could do that. If you want to combine it into one generalized mechanic, you could do that. But I think if you do this, the disadvantages is, yes, it's more work and it relies on you to be very creative. Not to be creative, but to be able to roll with what it's going to give you, because there can be a lot going on. The flooded tunnel might be a lot to manage, and then you're putting Clark on top of it. And if Clark had some special stuff going on, or maybe it was a different encounter, there could be a lot, right? You're piling more work on yourself. The advantage is with really no more work than setting up the normal dungeon, you get these situations that are very not only dynamic but unique to your game. You could run this dungeon 10 times and get 10. I mean, you can already get different things from what players do, right? The players are always a source of randomness and a source of dynamism, all their own. But even if your players did exactly the same stuff, if you're using a dynamic system like this, you're going to make it fresh. You're going to make it different every time you run it. And the players would never be able to just know, oh, okay, if we go around this way, we're going to find Clark over here. No, you don't know. Clark could be over there. Clark could be nowhere, right? What if you went through all the things and Clark never came up? You as a GM go, oh yeah, he's out hunting, he's out doing something, which is awesome because maybe the party leaves and then Clark comes home and finds out his whole tribe of goblins have been slaughtered. Now you've got this new antagonist out there who might be out gunning for the players, for the party. But first, of course, he's got to recruit some new troops because probably he's only got 2 goblins with him, so that's not enough. So let me know what you think in the comments, wherever you happen to see this. It's something that's been on my mind. I really want to try to figure out how to help folks get, and even for myself, right, really make our dungeons more dynamic. And this was one thing that I came up with, maybe my first thing, I guess, that I thought was a fairly easy, easy in quotes, easy fix to try, which is, like I said, decouple your creatures from the places, let the creatures wander around and let them fall where they may, and have fun. Me as a GM, it's always more fun for me where I don't know what's happening. I love to be surprised, just like the players are surprised. So have fun with these encounters and letting these things just kind of show up where they're going to show up, taking advantage or being disadvantaged, however the terrain is, and going with it and seeing how that works. Let me know if you think this is a great idea. Let me know if you think it's a horrible idea. If you like the videos, please subscribe. This helps me out a lot. Otherwise, I will talk to you later. Have a great day. Game on. I'm out.
Next.